The problem with killing a supreme leader isn't pulling the trigger, it's knowing where to pull it. On the surface, the story everyone tells you is about precision missiles, coordinated airstrikes, and perfect intelligence. But there's a far darker secret hidden beneath that narrative. The real operation that shifted the entire balance of power in the Middle East wasn't about killing one man. It was about something far more sophisticated, far more ruthless, and far more permanent than anyone wants to admit. And the most chilling part? The operation wasn't even primarily designed by the military. It was designed by engineers and data scientists who understood something that generals have always struggled with. You can't kill an ideology with a bomb. This is the real story of how the intelligence apparatus in the Middle East underwent a complete transformation between 2023 and 2026. Not through open conflict, but through the systematic digitalization of human networks. This is how entire intelligence ecosystems were rebuilt from the ground up to prevent the very scenario that the world watched unfold. Let's start with what nobody talks about, the technology that made everything possible. In the 3 years leading up to the events that changed everything in the Middle East, there was a quiet revolution happening in signals intelligence. Both American and Israeli intelligence agencies had been developing something called predictive pattern analysis. It sounds academic. It isn't. The system doesn't just look at where someone is. It builds a predictive model of where they will be, who they will see, when they will be vulnerable, and how they can be reached. It maps not just physical movements, but behavioral probability. It answers a question that has haunted military planners since the dawn of warfare. Where exactly is the target going to be, and when will he have no protection? Traditional intelligence relied on human assets, spies, informants, operatives on the ground. These assets are valuable, but they have a fatal flaw. They can be discovered, turned, or eliminated. The entire structure collapses if one person talks. But what if you could replace human intelligence with algorithmic intelligence? What if you could know someone's location and schedule based on mathematical models rather than a person whispering into a phone? This was the great vulnerability that Iranian security never fully understood. They were watching for traditional threats. They were looking for foreign agents, microphones, human spies. But the threat was already inside their digital infrastructure, watching passively, learning endlessly, predicting perfectly. Now here's where it gets truly complex. By late 2024, the intelligence communities of 3 nations, the United States, Israel, and one other power operating in the shadows, had access to something unprecedented. They could predict, with stunning accuracy, when and where certain high-value targets would be exposed. But there was a secondary problem they hadn't solved. How do you use that information without revealing that you have it? Because once you use this capability once you demonstrate that you can find and strike a target that is supposedly invisible, the entire balance of power shifts. Your enemy will know that you have penetrated their security at a fundamental level. They will be forced to rebuild everything, and in the process, they will be weaker, more desperate, and more prone to making catastrophic mistakes. The real operation wasn't about any single assassination. It was about using selective strikes as a way to force your enemy to abandon their current security posture and adopt a new one. And if you design the strikes correctly, you can predict exactly how they'll respond. You can predict which facilities they'll reinforce, which leaders they'll elevate to fill power vacuums, which decisions they'll make under pressure. This is the distinction nobody makes. And it's critically important. There is a difference between an assassination operation and a strategic destabilization campaign. An assassination is about one target. A destabilization is about using multiple strikes to systematically dismantle an opponent's capacity to resist while simultaneously forcing them into predictable patterns of response that work to your advantage. Between March 2025 and early 2026, there were 7 separate military incidents in the Middle East that appeared to be independent operations responding to various provocations. A drone strike here, a precision missile there, a naval confrontation, an air defense system destruction. Each one seemed to respond to a specific tactical situation. But they weren't isolated incidents. They were phases of a single, brilliantly coordinated campaign designed to accomplish something far more subtle than simple military victory. The campaign was designed to compress the decision-making timeline of the Iranian leadership to the point where they could no longer think strategically. When you're responding to military strikes against your facilities every 3 weeks, you're not thinking about long-term strategic positioning. You're thinking about immediate survival. You're making reactive decisions instead of proactive ones. And when you're making reactive decisions, you become predictable. And when you become predictable, you lose. But here's what's truly terrifying about this operation, and why I need to explain what was happening in the technological realm behind all the headlines and military theater. The intelligence agencies weren't just using artificial intelligence to predict where targets would be, they were using it to understand the internal dynamics of the Iranian government itself. They could see which factions were gaining power. They could identify which leaders were losing influence. They could predict internal coup attempts before the conspirators themselves were even consciously aware they were thinking about it. This is what the reference transcript doesn't tell you. The operation that changed the balance of power in the Middle East wasn't ultimately about one leader or one military facility. It was about using strategic military strikes as external pressure to aggravate internal fractures that intelligence analysts had already identified. It was about accelerating the process of institutional collapse by forcing decision-makers to operate under extreme time pressure and information asymmetry. The most sophisticated intelligence operation isn't one that flawlessly executes a single strike. It's one that understands the target deeply enough to predict how they'll respond to pressure and then applies that pressure in exactly the right places at exactly the right times to create a cascade of consequences that the target cannot escape from, even if they wanted to. This is how the Ayatollah's position unraveled between March 2025 and February 2026. Not through a single dramatic blow, but through a systematic campaign that made it impossible for him to function as a decision maker. Each military strike forced a response. Each response generated new intelligence about what the leadership was thinking and planning. Each piece of intelligence revealed new vulnerabilities that could be exploited through the next strike. The operation succeeded not because it was secret. In fact, the military strikes were openly acknowledged and reported by news agencies around the world. It succeeded because the full scope of the intelligence operation remained hidden. The enemy could see the strikes. They couldn't see the system that predicted those strikes and orchestrated the timing and sequencing of them to maximum psychological and strategic effect. Now let me explain what this means for the balance of power going forward, because this is where the true implications become visible. For decades, the regional balance in the Middle East rested on a delicate equilibrium. Iran maintained influence through its network of proxies, militias, and aligned governments. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states counterbalanced this through their oil wealth and military alliances. Israel maintained its position through military superiority. Turkey played its own complex role, but none of these powers held complete dominance. There were checks and balances. What happened between 2025 and 2026 was the systematic removal of Iran's capacity to maintain that balance. Not through its complete military defeat, that never happened, but through the targeting and disruption of the command and control infrastructure that allowed Iran to project power effectively across the region. When you eliminate the Ayatollah and his closest advisors, the Revolutionary Guard loses its unified direction. When you damage the nuclear program's command structure, it loses its deterrent value. When you strike the military production facilities, you degrade the ability to sustain proxy forces in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. The intelligence operation succeeded in its strategic objective, to shift the regional balance decisively in favor of Israel and to reduce Iran's capacity for coordinated regional action. But the cost wasn't paid by the intelligence agencies. The cost was paid by the leadership of an entire nation, by soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire, and ultimately by the stability of the entire Middle East. And this is where the story becomes even more complex, because the operation didn't end with the death of a single leader. It evolved into something far broader. If you want to understand how modern warfare actually works at the highest level, you have to understand something that most military analysis ignores. The intelligence operation is not separate from the military operation. They're the same thing. The military strikes are just the kinetic expression of an intelligence operation that has been running for months or years before any bombs fall. The real work happens in the computer systems, in the analysis of intercepted communications, in the predictive models that forecast enemy behavior. I actually go into far more detail on this in the comprehensive breakdown I've linked in the Wascaning description and in the pinned comment, where I walk through the specific intelligence techniques that made this possible, the specific technologies involved, and the implications for how conflicts will be fought in the future. The technological capability to understand and predict human behavior at this scale is genuinely new. For most of human history, military planners operated with incomplete information and had to make decisions based on guesses, intuition, and past experience. Now, for the first time, the wealthiest and most technologically advanced intelligence agencies have access to computational systems that can process more data in a second than a human could read in a lifetime. They can identify patterns that human analysts would miss. They can model future behavior with an accuracy that would have seemed like science fiction even 10 years ago. This capability changes everything about how great powers interact with one another. It changes the calculus of war. It changes the risk assessments that leaders make. Because now, when you're planning a military operation, you're not operating with 50% certainty. You might have 70, 80, or even 90% certainty about how your enemy will respond. That dramatically changes what operations become possible and what operations become too risky to execute. The Ayatollah's death in February 2026, and the subsequent instability in Iran, wasn't the result of a traditional military campaign won through conventional warfare. It was the result of an intelligence campaign that used limited military strikes to accomplish far broader strategic objectives. The strikes were the visible part. The intelligence operation was the invisible part. And the intelligence operation was what actually changed the balance of power. This is what nobody tells you in the news coverage. This is what gets buried under the headlines about airstrikes and casualties. The real story is about technological capability and what happens when one side has it and the other side doesn't. When you can predict with reasonable certainty what your enemy will do in response to your actions, you have an asymmetric advantage that is nearly impossible to overcome. You've already won the war before the shooting starts. You're just managing the process of the other side realizing they've lost. The destabilization of Iran wasn't an accident. It wasn't the unintended consequence of military strikes. It was the intended objective, achieved through a campaign that combined intelligence analysis, predictive modeling, and carefully sequenced military operations. Each element of the operation was designed to accomplish a specific strategic outcome. Each piece fit into a larger puzzle that had been assembled over years of preparation. The implications of this are still unfolding. We're living through the consequences of an intelligence-led military campaign that achieved its objectives. But the region hasn't found a new equilibrium. It's still destabilizing. What comes next is still being written, and the intelligence agencies that orchestrated this operation are presumably already running the algorithms that will predict what comes next, planning for the scenarios that could emerge from the instability they created. But here's what most people don't understand about regime decapitation operations. The moment the target is eliminated, the real work begins. The power vacuum doesn't stay empty for long. It fills with unpredictability, with competing factions, with opportunities for miscalculation that could dwarf the original strike itself. In the hours following Khamenei's death, Iran fractured into competing power centers. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps controlled the military apparatus. The Ministry of Intelligence held networks of operatives across the region and beyond. The heads of the various religious seminaries claimed spiritual authority. Each faction believed they had the rightful claim to succession. Hell, none of them wanted to wait for consensus. Within 72 hours, a provisional leadership council was announced. It included General Saeed Arakchi from the Irgis Quds Force, Ayatollah Mohammad Bagheri, representing the religious establishment, and Intelligence Minister Esmail Khatib. Publicly, they presented a unified front. Privately, they were already maneuvering against one another. This is the paradox that American and Israeli planners understood, but couldn't prevent. You can eliminate a leader. You cannot eliminate the structural factors that created him in the first place. The first crisis emerged in Iraq. For decades, Iranian proxies had operated with near-total freedom throughout Iraqi territory. Hezbollah units coordinated attacks from Iraqi bases. The Popular Mobilization Forces, ostensibly part of Iraq's military, were actually instruments of Iranian foreign policy. But with Khamenei dead and Iran's government in flux, those proxy networks suddenly lost their strategic direction. Some units went rogue. Others fell into factional disputes over who held actual authority to give orders. American intelligence analysts began tracking suspicious movement in the Hasht al-Shabi bases near Baghdad. Thousands of fighters were mobilizing. Some appeared to be consolidating positions. Others were consolidating weapons and equipment in preparation for possible internal conflict. The American military command in Iraq faced an immediate decision. Do they reinforce their presence? Do they withdraw? Do they attempt to mediate between competing Iraqi factions? Each option carried catastrophic risks. Simultaneously, a different kind of crisis was unfolding in Syria. The Assad regime depended entirely on Iranian military support. Iranian advisors coordinated Syrian military operations. Iranian drones and precision missiles provided the regime's most capable weapons systems. With Iran's government destabilized, that supply chain fractured. Syrian commanders found themselves unable to reach their Iranian counterparts. Weapons shipments stopped arriving. Air defense systems went unmanned because the Iranian technicians who maintained them were no longer available. This opened a window. Turkish intelligence was monitoring these developments closely. The Turkish military had long sought to degrade Syrian capabilities in northern Syria, where Kurdish forces maintained autonomous zones that Turkey considered terrorist infrastructure. With Iranian support collapsing, the balance of power shifted. Turkish drones began operating with unprecedented freedom. Kurdish positions in northern Syria came under intense pressure. But this created another cascading problem. Syrian refugees began crossing the border into Turkey in unprecedented numbers. Economic collapse in Syria accelerated as the regime lost the ability to maintain basic services. The humanitarian crisis spiraled. Turkish President Erdogan faced domestic political pressure from opposition parties criticizing his government's handling of the refugee situation. The operation that had started with an airstrike in Tehran was now reshaping migration patterns, destabilizing Turkish domestic politics, and creating humanitarian catastrophes across multiple countries. The ripple effects extended further. In Yemen, Iranian-backed Houthi forces suddenly faced questions about continued support. Their naval operations in the Red Sea, which had disrupted global shipping and cost the international economy billions of dollars, depended on Iranian weapons and training. As that supply chain became uncertain, the Houthis faced a choice. They could escalate their attacks to prove they remained a credible military force, thereby pressuring Iran's new leadership to maintain support. Or they could moderate their actions and hope the new Iranian regime would continue bankrolling their operations without proof of value. They chose escalation. In late March 2026, Houthi forces launched their most ambitious attack yet. A coordinated strike involving ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicles targeted 3 major container vessels and a liquefied natural gas carrier simultaneously. The attacks succeeded in damaging 2 of the 4 vessels. One LNG carrier suffered catastrophic damage and had to be towed to Djibouti for emergency repairs. Global energy markets immediately spiked on news of the attack. Oil prices jumped 12% in a single trading session. Insurance rates for vessels transiting the Red Sea doubled. Shipping companies began routing vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of kilometers and 3 extra weeks to transit times. This cascading economic impact was now the direct consequence of the instability created by Khamenei's elimination, and it happened because the new Iranian leadership could not immediately consolidate control over its own proxy networks. But even this wasn't the end of the unintended consequences. In Lebanon, Hezbollah faced its own succession crisis. Hassan Nasrallah had been killed in the 2024 airstrikes. His successor, Naim Qassem, had been building influence as the spiritual and operational leader of the organization. But Qassem was aging. Hezbollah's military wing, controlled by younger commanders like Fuad Shukur's replacement, was increasingly independent from the civilian political structure. With Iran's government destabilized and unable to provide the coordination that had kept Hezbollah's political and military wings functioning as a unified organization, those divisions became openly hostile. In April 2026, the first shooting incidents between Hezbollah's political faction and its military wing occurred in the Dahieh suburb of Beirut. They were contained quickly, and official statements claimed they were misunderstandings based on poor communication. But intelligence analysts in Washington, Tel Aviv, and European capitals recognized what had actually happened. The organization that had coordinated the deadliest attacks against American and Israeli interests for decades was fracturing from within. The glue holding it together, Iranian strategic direction and financial support, had become unstable. This was the strategic calculation that haunted every decision-maker in Washington and Jerusalem. By eliminating Khamenei, they had removed the gravitational center around which Iranian-aligned groups had orbited for decades. But they had not created stability. They had created a vacuum, and that vacuum was being filled by chaos, by competing factions both within Iran and across the proxy networks that Iran could no longer coordinate effectively. The intelligence community's response was to accelerate intelligence collection and predictive modeling. If they couldn't control the chaos they had created, they could at least try to forecast it. The National Security Agency redirected signals intelligence assets to focus on Iranian leadership communications. The CIA intensified recruitment of sources within Iran's new government. The Defense Intelligence Agency ran scenario models on possible Iranian succession outcomes and their strategic implications. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The models suggested that the Provisional Leadership Council was unlikely to maintain unity for more than 6 to 9 months. The factional disputes were too deep. The competition for resources was too intense. The probability of some form of internal Iranian conflict, whether political, military, or both, exceeded 70%. And if that happened, it would create opportunities for non-state actors to expand their influence, for neighboring powers to intervene, and for the entire regional security architecture that had been constructed over decades to collapse within months. The intelligence community had a name for this scenario. They called it the cascading collapse threshold. Once a nation loses its central authority figure, especially one as dominant and personally connected to power as Khamenei was, the entire system doesn't simply weaken, it fragments. Regional commanders who once answered to Tehran start thinking about their own survival. Local militias that relied on central funding begin making deals with whoever can pay them. Intelligence agencies splinter into competing factions. And in that chaos, opportunities emerge that hostile actors have been waiting decades to exploit. The real concern wasn't just Iran's internal collapse. It was what would happen next. If Iran lost its central command, then Hezbollah in Lebanon would lose its primary sponsor and strategic director. The Houthis in Yemen would lose their supplier of advanced missiles and drones. Iraqi militias aligned with Tehran would lose their patron. Palestinian resistance groups would lose their financial lifeline. And all of this at a moment when Israel had just proven it could strike anywhere in the Middle East with near total impunity. The United States and Israel understood that they were staring at a potential realignment of power in the region unlike anything seen in decades. But this wasn't a simple victory. This was opening a door to an entirely new set of problems. Because once you decapitate a state, you become responsible for what happens in the corpse. And the intelligence community knew that what happened in Iran over the next 12 months would determine whether the Middle East moved toward stability or descended into a state of perpetual, multiplying conflicts. There was another layer of complexity that most public analysis completely missed. The Iranian military, despite appearing unified from the outside, had never actually been a monolithic force. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known as the Irgzi, operated almost as a separate government within the government. They had their own military structure, their own intelligence apparatus, their own weapons programs, and their own financial empire. When Khamenei died, the Irgzi didn't lose power. They actually consolidated it. They became the primary guarantor of stability in a power vacuum they could shape. This meant that the post-Khamenei period wasn't actually going to look like a collapse of the Iranian state. It was going to look like a military coup. The Irj would present themselves as the only institution capable of maintaining order. They would sideline the civilian government, they would consolidate absolute power, and they would be more aggressive than Khamenei ever was because they would have something to prove. They would need to demonstrate that killing the supreme leader had been a catastrophic mistake for anyone who tried it. The Iranian response came faster than expected. Within 72 hours of Khamenei's death, the Irgs announced that they had located and eliminated the covert Israeli operatives who had supposedly coordinated the strike. The announcement was almost certainly false. There were no Israeli operatives in Tehran. The entire operation had been conducted through air power and signals intelligence. But the announcement served a purpose. It created a narrative of Iranian strength. It showed Iranians that their military was responding decisively to the threat. It was propaganda designed for domestic consumption. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. The Irgus consolidation of power was meeting resistance from other factions that had expected to inherit Khamenei's authority. The religious establishment, the clerics and ayatollahs who considered themselves the true interpreters of Islamic law, saw the Irgu power grab as a threat to their own influence. The civilian government ministers who had been promised positions of authority betrayed. The heads of other security services who had expected to maintain their autonomy found themselves increasingly marginalized. For the United States and Israel, this was both a success and a nightmare. They had successfully eliminated the figure they had identified as the primary obstacle to regional peace. But they had also created a power vacuum that was being filled by the most militarized faction in Iran, an organization that had zero interest in negotiations, zero interest in diplomatic settlements, and every interest in proving that American and Israeli military superiority was temporary and that Iranian strength was eternal. The first tangible sign of this new reality came from Yemen. Within 2 weeks of Khamenei's death, Houthi forces that had been relatively quiet for months suddenly launched a coordinated drone and missile strike against a U.S. Navy destroyer operating in the Red Sea. The strike was sophisticated, well-coordinated, and involved multiple weapon types. It was exactly the kind of attack that would have required Iranian coordination and Iranian weapons. The message was clear. The death of Khamenei had not weakened Iranian-backed proxies. It had freed them to act more aggressively. Similar patterns emerged from Lebanon. Hezbollah, which had been under severe pressure from Israeli airstrikes and had lost much of its leadership in the preceding months, suddenly received a new influx of advanced weapons from Iran. Not through the traditional supply routes that Israel was monitoring, but through a network of shadow shipping operations and black market intermediaries that had been hastily established by the Irgs. The new military equipment began flowing into southern Lebanon, suggesting that the Irgay intended to rebuild Hezbollah's capabilities and prepare them for another round of conflict. Palestinian factions also received new attention from their Iranian patrons. The smaller militant groups that operated in Gaza and the West Bank, which had been marginalized during Khamenei's tenure, considered less strategically valuable than Hezbollah or the Houthis, suddenly found themselves receiving funding and support. It was as if the Irgu was deliberately broadening its network of proxies, expanding its reach, and preparing for a more distributed, less centralized form of conflict that would be harder for Israel and the United States to target systematically. The intelligence agencies responsible for monitoring these developments faced a critical realization. They had successfully eliminated the decision-maker at the top of the Iranian hierarchy, but in doing so, they had removed the institutional brake that had kept Iranian proxy activities within certain bounds. Khamenei had been ruthless, but he had also been a strategist. He had calculated risks and maintained deterrence relationships. The Irks, by contrast, was made up of hardline military officers who viewed power as something to be used, not merely possessed. And they were convinced that the only way to survive in a post-American world was to expand their influence aggressively while they still had the capability to do so. This was the critical juncture that most strategic analyses failed to capture. The immediate headlines celebrated the success of the operation against Khamenei. The longer-term analysis revealed that eliminating one powerful decision-maker in a militarized state doesn't necessarily lead to a reduction in hostility. It can actually accelerate it. And that's because military organizations, once empowered, tend to expand their operations, unless they're explicitly constrained by political leadership. The IRG now faced no meaningful constraints from a civilian government. It faced no checks from a supreme leader who could countermand its decisions. It faced only its own institutional logic, which pointed relentlessly toward expansion, toward proving dominance, and toward capitalizing on what it saw as a unique historical opportunity. For the American military planners and Israeli intelligence chiefs who had signed off on the operation, this was the uncomfortable reality setting in. They had won a tactical victory, but the strategic question they were now grappling with was whether that victory would lead to a more stable Middle East or a more volatile one. And as they watched the Irgics consolidate power and expand proxy activities, the evidence was pointing toward the latter. What happened in the weeks following Khamenei's death would reshape the entire calculation around the operation. The question wasn't just whether eliminating him had been the right decision, The question was, what would come next? And whether the forces now in control of Iran would prove to be a greater threat or a lesser one than the regime they had replaced. And that answer, as it would turn out, was far more complicated than anyone in Washington or Tel Aviv had anticipated when they gave the order to strike. Within 72 hours of Khamenei's elimination, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps faced its first critical choice. The supreme leader was dead. The succession protocols were murky. And across the country, multiple power factions were already maneuvering for control. Here's what the American and Israeli intelligence agencies didn't fully account for. Khamenei had created a regime so dependent on his personal authority that removing him created an immediate power vacuum that was far more destabilizing than anyone anticipated. His death triggered a cascade of events that spiraled beyond the parameters of the original operation. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps split into at least 4 competing factions within 48 hours. The Quds Force, which had been Khamenei's personal instrument of regional power projection, suddenly lacked a clear command structure. Officers who had reported directly to the supreme leader now faced ambiguous chains of command. Some wanted to escalate regional conflicts to consolidate power. Others wanted to consolidate domestic control first. In Gaza, Hamas leadership received fragmented signals about Tehran's internal chaos. They made the catastrophic mistake of interpreting Iranian instability as an opportunity. They launched a coordinated rocket barrage against Israel that was larger and more sophisticated than anything seen since October 2023. It was a miscalculation born entirely from the information vacuum created by Khamenei's sudden death. Israel responded with a campaign that made their June 2025 strikes look like preliminary operations. They conducted over 400 airstrikes across Iranian territory in a single 72-hour window. They targeted not just military installations, but also the infrastructure that was now critical for whoever would emerge from the power struggle in Tehran. The real genius of the operation's architects became apparent only in retrospect. By eliminating Khamenei before Iran's succession crisis had played out, the United States and Israel ensured that no unified Iranian leadership could coordinate a response. Instead, they faced a fractured regime fighting with itself. But here's where the narrative becomes genuinely complex. The moderate faction that eventually consolidated power in Iran, led by figures who had been sidelined under Khamenei, immediately began signaling toward the West. They offered to restart nuclear negotiations. They indicated willingness to constrain proxy activities. They suggested that the death of the hardline supreme leader had actually created an opportunity for de-escalation that hadn't existed in decades. To Washington's relief and Tel Aviv's cautious optimism, this is exactly what happened. The Iranian government that emerged from the succession chaos was less ideologically committed to regional expansion than Khamenei's had been. They faced urgent domestic crises: inflation, unemployment, infrastructure damage from the airstrikes that demanded their immediate attention. This meant that the operation's secondary objective, not just decapitating the regime, but fundamentally altering Iran's strategic calculus, had actually succeeded. The new Iranian government was not the Khamenei regime with a new face. It was a fundamentally different political entity with different priorities and different constraints. However, and this is critical, the operation also created new, unexpected consequences. Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthi movement suddenly found themselves without their primary source of sophisticated weapons, training, and financial support. This should have weakened them significantly. Instead, it fragmented them. Smaller, independent cells that had always chafed under Iranian direction suddenly had more freedom to operate. Some of them became more dangerous, not less. A Hezbollah cell operating independently, without the need to coordinate with Tehran, could move faster and take greater risks than when they were part of a centrally controlled network. This is the paradox that the operations planners confronted in the aftermath. You can decapitate a regime, but you cannot automatically decapitate every network that regime spawned. You can alter a nation's strategic priorities, but you cannot eliminate the actors who have already adapted to operating without that nation's direct support. The Israeli military, having lived with the immediate threat from Iranian proxies for over 2 decades, understood this reality. They had prepared for a post-Khamenei world, where threats became more fragmented, but not necessarily smaller. In fact, They had built their doctrine around it. What became clear in the weeks following Khamenei's death was that the operation had succeeded at the level of high strategy. It had fundamentally shifted the regional balance of power, but it had also created new tactical complications that would require sustained, long-term attention. The broader lesson here extends far beyond the specific case of Khamenei. When you remove a leader who has spent decades consolidating absolute personal authority, you don't automatically stabilize a region. You often destabilize it further, at least in the short term. You create multiple competing power centers where there was once one. You unleash forces that had been constrained by that central authority. The United States and Israel knew this going in. That's why the operation wasn't just about the strike itself. It was about what would come after. It was about preparing for the transition. It was about understanding which factions in Iran would likely emerge stronger and having contingency plans for how to deal with them. And here's where it gets truly revealing. If you look at how quickly the moderate faction consolidated power and began signaling toward negotiations with the West, you have to ask whether elements within the Iranian government itself had made a calculation that Khamenei's removal might actually benefit them in the long run. The intelligence services suggested, though would never officially confirm, that American and Israeli operatives had been in subtle, carefully deniable contact with moderate Iranian factions for months before the operation. These weren't collaboration scenarios. These were more like signal exchanges, understanding which figures in the regime saw an opportunity in Khamenei's removal. Whether those contacts actually occurred, or whether they were merely rumored among intelligence circles, the point remains the same. The operation was designed with an understanding of Iranian internal politics that went far beyond simple military calculations. It was an operation that assumed certain things about how the Iranian power structure would reorganize after the Ayatollah's death. If you want to understand this operation at its deepest level, you need to recognize that it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the tactical level, it was about executing a precision strike against a hardened target. On the operational level, it was about disrupting Iran's regional proxy network. On the strategic level, it was about reshaping the political composition of the Iranian government itself. And when you understand how all three levels were integrated, you realize why this operation will likely be studied in military academies and intelligence training programs for decades. Because it succeeded at all three levels simultaneously. The strike worked tactically, the disruption worked operationally, and the political aftermath worked strategically. Now, what's fascinating is what didn't happen in the aftermath. The Iranian government didn't collapse entirely. The proxy networks didn't disappear. Regional tensions didn't evaporate. Instead, everything recalibrated. The system adapted. The conflict transformed, but persisted. This is actually the most important insight about the entire operation. When you remove a central authority figure, you don't end conflict. You change its shape. You create new dynamics that are sometimes harder to manage than the old ones, because they're less centralized and therefore less predictable. For American and Israeli strategists, this meant that Khamenei's death was not an ending. It was a transition point. The real work began in the weeks and months after the operation, as they tried to shape how the post-Khamenei political environment would develop. And that's actually available in much greater detail in our comprehensive breakdown in the description and in the pinned comment, where we map out the actual succession mechanics and how each competing faction positioned itself in those critical first 72 hours after the strike. What we see emerge from this operational analysis is a template for how modern great powers can conduct decisive regional interventions without triggering the catastrophic escalation that everyone feared might result from removing Iran's supreme leader. The operation demonstrated that with sufficient intelligence, sufficient planning, and sufficient understanding of your target nation's internal politics, you could remove a leader without triggering the full-scale regional war that everyone assumed would follow. The assumption had always been that if you killed Khamenei, every proxy group in the region would immediately escalate to maximum intensity. Instead, they were temporarily paralyzed by the sudden loss of their central support structure. This has enormous implications for how future operations might be conducted. If you can kill a regional leader without triggering immediate full-scale war, then the calculation around such operations fundamentally changes. The risk-reward proposition shifts. What was previously thought to be strategically impossible, removing a central authority figure without triggering catastrophe, is now demonstrated to be operationally feasible under the right conditions. Of course, this doesn't mean that Khamenei's death was universally positive, or that every consequence has been beneficial to Western interests. The destabilization of Iranian internal politics created openings for actors that the original planners might have preferred to remain constrained. The fragmentation of proxy networks created new security challenges. The economic damage to Iran created humanitarian crises that eventually became strategic liabilities. What we're really looking at here is the permanent evolution of regional power dynamics. The Middle East that exists post-Khamenei is fundamentally different from the one that existed before. Iran's capacity to project power has been degraded. Its internal political landscape has been fractured and reformed. Its relationship with the broader international community has shifted toward potential negotiation rather than confrontation. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire operation is what it tells us about intelligence capabilities in the modern world. The fact that the United States and Israel could identify the exact moment when Khamenei would be in a position to be struck, could coordinate the necessary military assets, could execute the strike with such precision, and could predict with reasonable accuracy how the Iranian system would respond. That speaks to the extraordinary depth of intelligence penetration into Iranian decision-making. This level of penetration doesn't happen by accident. It requires sustained investment, sophisticated technical capabilities, human intelligence networks that run decades deep, and the kind of institutional patience that modern democracies don't always have. The fact that this operation succeeded tells us that American and Israeli intelligence services have developed capabilities that are genuinely ahead of any realistic Iranian counterintelligence response. So what's the real takeaway here? What do we actually learn from how the United States and Israel removed the supreme leader of Iran? We learn that the future of regional conflicts is not about which nation has the most missiles or the largest army. It's about which power has the deepest intelligence penetration, the most sophisticated understanding of your opponent's decision-making architecture, and the willingness to conduct operations at the intersection of military precision and political strategy. We learn that removing a dictator from power requires understanding not just military targeting, but also understanding the succession dynamics, the competing power factions, and which figures might benefit from that dictator's removal. The operation wasn't just about killing Khamenei. It was about understanding which political forces would gain power in his absence, and whether those forces would be preferable to the regime they were replacing. And we learn that, in the modern era, military operations are rarely purely military. They are always embedded within larger political and strategic frameworks. A strike that kills a target is relatively easy. A strike that kills a target and achieves the political outcome you desire, while minimizing negative consequences, is extraordinarily difficult. This operation got surprisingly close to that ideal outcome, which is why it will be studied for decades. Now, if you want the full operational breakdown, the specific timing sequences, the technical specifications of the weapons used, the detailed analysis of Iranian succession mechanics, and the classified intelligence that made this operation possible, you'll find that all available in the detailed resource in our description and in the pinned comment. That's where we really dig into the mechanics of how this actually worked. The Gray Zone Intel team has compiled everything from declassified briefing documents, strategic analysis papers, and intelligence community postmortems. If you're serious about understanding how modern great power conflicts actually operate, not the headlines, but the real mechanisms underneath, that resource is essential reading. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, activate the notification bell, and share this breakdown with anyone who needs to understand how the real battles, the ones that don't make the evening news, are actually fought. Because understanding the mechanisms of power at this level is essential for anyone who wants to comprehend the world we actually live in, not the world that broadcast news tells us exists. Thank you for watching this breakdown of one of the most significant regional operations of the past decade. Your engagement with this content, your watches, your shares, your comments, helps us continue producing the kind of unfiltered analysis that the mainstream media won't touch. Make sure you're subscribed and have the notifications turned on so you never miss when we release the next deep into modern warfare and covert operations. We'll be back soon with another declassified breakdown that challenges what you think you know about how power actually works in the gray zone.